conversation about this period in history. I think I grew up in Ethiopia, and even once I left, I heard about this war. Of course, I heard about the moments of defiance and heroism, but the war lasted 5 years, and no one could tell me what happened on a daily basis. Nobody had those details. And I've also heard back from Ethiopians saying it's the first time that they've ever had details about what the war was like at all, period. Outside of those moments of confrontation with Italians. And that's been wonderful to hear. I didn't know it either. It took a lot of research to find some of this stuff out.
Where did you do that research? Was it in Ethiopia, Italy as well, I imagine?
Yeah, a lot in Italy. They had photographs. They had documents. There were the newspapers that were written, but in Ethiopia, I was getting the oral stories, the histories that I would ask people things about family members, about locations, driving through with a cousin who knows so much and saying, okay, tell me where the caves were. Those kinds of things I did in Ethiopia. But in terms of artifacts, things that were saved that I could read, I did a lot of it in Italy. I did a lot in the UK. I was looking at photographs, journals, letters, albums, newspapers, and from there, piecing bits of information together because it's never all in one place, and trying to create a more holistic vision of what that time was like.
How much, we touched on it right at the beginning, but how much history remains undigested in Ethiopia today?
With this period, or just in general?
In general, and how does it affect the politics of the day?
I think that history is contested territory right now in Ethiopia. I think people know a lot from one perspective. And the narratives are being fought over right now, which is part of the tensions, which is really the tensions that are happening in Ethiopia, the ethnic tensions. And I've had somebody explain to me, there are people who are arguing about what happened in the 1800s, and the other people are going back and saying, you can't talk about the 1800s unless you talk about 1600s. And this is the level of discourse and the historical discourse happening now. This is where I'm very aware of the nature of the biases in history, the way that history really is a series of narratives created by human beings to to reshape memory and or national identity, and countries that break apart because different ethnic groups cannot get along or different religions cannot get along. They're relying on the histories that are biased, whether it's on one side or the other. And it's dangerous territory right now. And we're seeing that all around the world. And I think, we're living in the United States right now, where politicians would like to have some of the rest of us believe in a kind of, historical amnesia that America began when the settlers came in, and that it hadn't existed before, and that there were not groups of people wiped out. History is dangerous, and I think we've known that, but it's becoming more and more clear to me how really biased all these narratives are, and it's through the stories we tell now that we might be able to find an even ground. And I'm thinking of Germany and the way that it just did not shy from everything that happened during World War II, and those were ugly moments, and the discourse, I'm sure, was tiring for some people, but it felt absolutely necessary in order to create some kind of foundation to begin creating a different kind of national identity after all that trauma. Yeah, so it's a good question you're asking. I'm a little bit, I'm very worried about what's happening in Ethiopia. And I don't have, I'm not there. I'm not in it the way that some of my friends, and journalists and those people I know are. But it feels to me like a series of colliding narratives that's happening, and it's at the cost of lives, unfortunately.
I mean, we've just lived through the national trauma of Brexit in the United Kingdom. So in a way, what would be ideal is if, in Ethiopia, in all countries, there could be a much greater emphasis on history and the difficult historical work of looking back, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, constantly, really.
Yeah, it's how far back do you go? I think that's the question. Yeah. Yeah, I'm watching, with a heavy heart and with a little bit of hope, of what's happening. It's, I was in Ethiopia last January, a few months into the tenure of the Prime Minister Abiy, and the level of goodwill that I seem to sense in casual conversations, the way that people suddenly, you could just sense the weight that had been lifted and the hope that was there. It's really different from when I was there now, just a few weeks ago. But I do think that there, of course, there's a chance. There are things happening there. There are some positive things also. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed, and I hope that it pulls through. But it really is about that history, that narrative, and how far back we go, and making sure that it's fair, which feels naive to even say.
But perhaps that's the only thing that can be done. I mean, maybe the sort of the Prime Minister's insistence on, and I'm going to butcher the word, but medemer, this idea of, of unity. It does feel a little bit like an attempt, however artificial, to create some kind of national consciousness. But I guess if you live in the south of the country, and that your own personal history of the 1800s, of your family's history, the history of the land you're living in, you would have a lot of pent up bitterness, really, about how that had happened.
Yeah, it's like it's something that I was really aware of when I was creating the character of the cook, who's a person who's enslaved, who was stolen from her family, who looks at Kidana and Aster, when the war is coming and the Italians are coming in, and she looks at them and she says, "I'm not fighting for you. The Italians will probably treat me much better than you have ever treated me. And I would rather have any kind of rule than yours." There's no sense of loyalty for her. There's no, Ethiopia. What is it to fight for Ethiopia when you're not even free within that country? She doesn't want to do that. And I think that narrative was more prevalent during that time, and has always been there, more so than we think about when we think about Ethiopia.
That's all for this week. Our thanks to Maaza Mengiste. If you enjoyed it, even if you didn't, tell someone who might be interested about the podcast, and do give us a glowing write-up on iTunes or wherever you get your pods. You can say hi on Twitter @NickNorbrook and @The Africa Report, and also on Facebook. To get our daily 5-bullet newsletter, sign up on our website, theafricareport.com. That's all for now. Thanks for listening.